All right, well, the other big story today, loved by some, hated by others, that is the legacy of former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, who has died at the age of 95. He was the country's longest-serving president at nearly 40 years. Let's get some more on this. I'm joined by Africa analyst Mike Saluma and MDC NEC member and human rights lawyer Mugabes, both joining me this evening. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. As you both know, very mixed reactions. Some people don't know whether they are rejoicing at this news. Others don't know whether they are mourning Robert Mugabe. Let's start with you, Mugabes. I mean, as an MDC member, how are you feeling about this news?
Mr. Mugabe's contribution to the liberation of Zimbabwe and to the advancement of the African agenda, the fight against colonialism, is one he should be celebrated for and thanked for his contribution. Post-independence in Zimbabwe, he created a culture of political violence and political intolerance. And on his death, he leaves Zimbabwe a broken nation and a broken people. And I think it is important that while we celebrate and appreciate his contribution to the liberation of Zimbabwe, it must be stated quite categorically that he was a murderer, he was a fascist, he was a dictator. He is responsible for the suffering of many Zimbabweans post-independence. He was responsible for Operation Mrambachina. He killed our people in Matabeleland. So the legacy that we leave with him is that which he has caused the pain of so many Zimbabweans.
And Mike, that seems to be the sentiment, is that he could have been so much more. Robert Mugabe had a good start. Things looked positive and brilliant. He took over such a thriving nation at the time, the breadbasket of Africa. What went wrong?
I think that as Mugabes is saying, that Robert Mugabe's contribution to the liberation, not just of Zimbabwe, but of the African continent, including South Africa, cannot be wished away. I think if you look at Robert Mugabe, you're looking at a generation of African leaders who made sure that colonialism was defeated on the African continent. Yes. You're talking about people like Kenneth Kaunda, you're talking about people like Samora Machel, you're talking about people like Julius Nyerere, So he belongs in that in the generation of leaders. And I think that if you were to judge him on that alone, I think that he would get 10 out of 10 as a leader of Zimbabwe and of the continent. However, I think for me the greatest disappointment, one of the greatest disappointments, is that he started out as a revolutionary. He started out as a socialist even, but in the latter half of his political career, he actually lived up to the stereotype of the post-colonial African leader. In other words, a leader who frees people and then decides to live a better life than his own people, which is shown. Actually, I think it's very significant that he dies in Singapore and he doesn't die in Pararanyachoa Hospital in Harare. So it is that kind of, he lives up to that stereotype that African leaders tend to think that their lives are, it's almost like an animal farm-like thing, that if everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. So African leaders will provide services to their own people that they themselves will not use. Yeah. So it's a very big disappointment that he ended up like that himself.
That he became obsessed with power and he was power hungry, and that was the beginning of the end of what he could have achieved.
Yes, I think that he did become obsessed with power, but I think that you also need to look at the dynamic in ZANU-PF itself. I think that again, it's a post-colonial phenomenon, on the continent, where there is the emergence of networks of patronage. So that towards the end of his rule as president of Zimbabwe, he is actually no longer in charge. He is the mascot for a whole lot of for this massive network of an elite that is eating and feeding and feasting off the state, and he is the figurehead of that.
And it continues to I suppose, take that from the people of Zimbabwe. I mean, if you have to look, and I'm just looking at what David Coltart had to say about him, saying he was a colossus on the Zimbabwean stage, and his enduring positive legacy will be his role in ending white minority rule, and when it came to quality education. And that was it. And I think many people would agree that that's all if he had to put on his resume was some of the better things that Robert Mugabe actually did.
Well, we can't praise a fish for swimming. He inherited an economy that was extremely stable. I think almost 1:1, if not 1:2, with the British pound at the time. The resources in the state were there. The Ian Smith regime had created a functional economy which was so functional, so much so that it was able to withstand the sanctions that had been put on Zimbabwe by those who were supporting the liberation of Zimbabwe. So it is true that generally speaking, the education system in Zimbabwe was strong, but I don't think that that achievement should be exaggerated, because exaggerating it is essentially praising a fish for swimming.
I mean, there's also been a lot of debate over the past couple of years, decades, I suppose, about the role that Grace Mugabe played and whether she was really, you know, the puppet master in all of this, and how much of this was Robert Mugabe. Was he a man who just did things on his own? Do we talk about Grace Mugabe and just possibly what her role in all of this was, stoking the fires in the background, and the other men and women he surrounded himself with who allowed this to happen? And that kind of echoes a lot of what's happening here. I don't want to mention other names, but let's stick to Robert Mugabe.
No. I think Mugabe must be judged on his own script. The contributions of friends, family, wives and brothers and sisters is something that happens ordinarily in everyone's life. But when judgment time comes, it cannot be attributed to anyone else other than the primary actor himself. If Mugabe is a hero who fought against apartheid, who fought against colonialism, who advanced, as he should have, the cause of African people, then on his demise and everything else that is negative that would have been attributed to him should equally fall on him, without excuse on the wife, or on the children, or on the friends, or on anyone else who was surrounding him. The reality is that Mugabe has caused suffering of people post-independence. That country had a lot of potential, and that country still possesses that potential. And the much problematic thing about Mugabe is that not only did he cause violence, which is periodic, systemic and relevant for that particular moment, he has created a culture of violence. So to undo that culture of violence would require a lot of time. Zimbabwe needs to go through a healing process, arising from the very same culture that he has created. He's leaving a country that is broken, and a broken nation.
And his leaving almost 2 years ago really did very little to make the situation better. It's just another print of him. It's just the same thing, Mike. I mean, they really are. And I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we had Zimbabweans saying things are so bad. You know, it's even worse than it was under Mugabe. We'd rather have him back.
Mm-hmm. I think, Iveka, that for me, what Robert Mugabe, the legacy that Robert Mugabe has left for Zimbabwe from an economic point of view is very instructive for us in South Africa, because, you know, there is a view that says that when we say that, look, you know, the thing that Mugabes has to say, what state did Robert Mugabe leave Zimbabwe in? Economically, we would say that he actually left it in a terrible state. Actually, he wrecked a whole lot of things. He wrecked an economy that was existing, and he lives, you know, right now, a lot of Zimbabweans have been scattered literally all over the world, looking for a better life because of his choices. Now, there's a view that says, no, it wasn't his fault. It was because of Tony Blair. It was because of the Americans. It was because of... I think that it's very instructive for us, because that kind of language is also beginning to surface in South Africa, to scapegoat. That I think that African leaders need to begin to take responsibility for their actions and to accept agency, and not have to say, so-and-so made me do it. That's why I couldn't deliver this, because such and such was sabotaging me, etc., etc.
And very quickly, I just want to know from Mugabes just the response from South Africa and how they reacted, and the praise that was heaped on Robert Mugabe by Cyril Ramaphosa earlier today.
Well, I think for a variety of reasons, South Africans have, and I'm generalizing, of course, have a particular creation of a Mugabe they want, who is not the Mugabe that we experienced. So when someone praises Mugabe, I tend to sympathize and understand them, because they have a particular view and a creature of Mugabe, a particular character they've created which they seek to praise. But we have a personal experience of Mugabe, so I would not condemn them, or simply understand where they're coming from.
And Mike, just from you, I mean, for Cyril Ramaphosa to say that in a week where to praise Robert Mugabe in a week where we've seen people who fled Zimbabwe because of Robert Mugabe come here and be subjected to what they were. Many of them, I'm sure, victims of what we saw happening on our streets this week.
I think that it's the way that African leaders have generally and historically dealt with one another. You know, when the African peer review mechanism was put in place, we thought that, well, finally, we're getting to a period in Africa's history where leaders will be frank and open and direct with one another. But I think there's a long culture of politeness, of not interfering in other people, in the internal affairs of other countries, etc., and being eternally, perpetually polite to each other. But I suspect if you were to ask the former president of Botswana, Ian Khama, you might get a very different reaction to what you've got from a President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thanks for your time. And well, I suppose let's see what happens next in Zimbabwe after all of this. I suspect